The frosty breath of Laganea bit through the foothills of the Glacian Mountains. Orange flickering light from the flames billowing from the stables in the courtyard bounced off the mountainside, and the grey plumes of smoke billowing from the burning farms in the valley mingled with the threads of clouds in the deep blue night sky. Chaemouron Cletaios drew his sword from the armpit of the last invader and wiped the blade on a pile of snow. In the fresh snow within the walls of the fortress overlooking his Dumayad, the settlement that produced resources for the Kothanut, his last budding wife lay in a pool of blood. He knelt beside her, cradled the cold body in his arms. So, we just heard a snippet from the beginning chapter of Fury of a Chaemouron, which is your second short story. Leonard, could you tell me a bit about what this story is about in essence?
It's a story about vengeance. So the story starts with the Chaemouron, which is a sort of a steward. Mm-hmm. Well, let's say he's the Batarian variant of a samurai.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So he has this little settlement which produces horses for the Kothanut, so the big...
The shogun, basically.
Yeah, kinda, if you want to compare it with that. So that gets attacked by some assassins, and everyone is dead. All stables are on fire, and he finds the boy, a little stable hand, a boy. And yeah, that was a bit of the MacGuffin that set the story going, and from there on, he's trying to find out who's behind the attacks, why are they doing this, and eventually he finds the one that orchestrated the attack, and he takes vengeance.
Yes.
That's kind of what it's about in short.
And we kind of start in this snowy landscape, and we're dropped with this quite stoic guy, and like you just explained it, it's kind of in hindsight where you can explain all this, but there must have been like an initial spark where you felt like this is a story I want to tell. Like what inspired the initial idea? What is the first thing you had as an idea that kind of formed the story?
Well, this is kind of interesting. I'm of the school that believes that stories, but also music or art in general, has to be born out of necessity. Mm-hmm. But for this story, I didn't have anything. I didn't have an idea. I was just finished with the previous story, Trials of Texas, and I think I called you, and I said, I want to write another story, but I've absolutely nothing. Mm-hmm. And then we started brainstorming a little bit, and we came to the conclusion, you know what would be really cool is Ice Samurais.
Yeah, and just to explain to listeners a little bit as well, I'm a Japanophile. I love everything about Japan. I'm also a big fan of Akira Kurosawa and samurai, so I was very excited about this idea because there's, to me, nothing more exciting than a lone wolf protagonist, and the samurai in that are very able, skilled antagonists. And that is also something that you really, really placed in this story. A very able, stoic man, a lone wolf. So yeah.
Yeah, and since my previous story didn't have that much dialogue, I wanted to have something, just the dynamics between two people. Mm-hmm. And that's when I came up with the boy, and I think, but I don't have the timestamps of when I did certain things, but I guess it might be inspired by God of War. Mm-hmm. I think that has to be it, but I'm not quite sure.
I think that if I remember well, I think that God of War came out in 2018. That's the first timestamp. And I know you were writing it before Ghost of Tsushima. Because at some point I said, like, oh, maybe Ghost of Tsushima could be a game that we want to buy. It hadn't come out yet. And I know that if we go a little further into the past of us developing the Betharian Empire, we did have this idea of like a Mongolian force taking over the big empire that is at that point ruling everything and waging war on everything. And there would be a bigger bad in that sense, and that felt very interesting to us because there's a lot of empires that fell because of their own faults and their own stuck in their ways, and other people taking abuse of that. And I think that there's even like hints of that in there. So I wouldn't say that, for instance, I thought that the invasion itself was based on Ghost of Tsushima, but when I thought about it, going further back, you had that initial idea already way before that came out, and I think it stems back from that. I think God of War is part of it, but I think it's more even just the element of a innocent kid with an old man.
Which sounds really bad if you state it that way.
yeah. But yeah, you get my point of yeah, like The Road is a book that does this quite well. God of War, Last of Us. But what do you think is, because you said you wanted a lot of dialogue, and then I think this is a really interesting thing to get your point on, because you want a lot of dialogue, so you put a naive young kid and a veteran together, someone that knows everything and someone that knows nothing, the writer and the reader. Mm-hmm. But you decided to make the old man stoic, and he's not that wordy. He's not a very outspoken man. How did you develop that dynamic between the two?
Yeah, that's what I found interesting. The boy who's all talkative and wants to know everything, and this old man who only speaks to convey a message and not to just make sound, like a lot of people do. And that's basically the inspiration for the Betharians. Just speak when you need to speak, or else shut up. And that's something that's a value I hold close to my heart also in real life.
So you have of course the Chaemouron, who is a Betharian, and the kid, which is part of the original natives, I think, that lived there.
Yeah, I call them Hrezdanians.
Yeah.
And they're inspired by I believe it was the Proto-Slavic European people. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it was Proto-Slavic or maybe Slavic, I don't know. But one of their customs was the kids growing a sort of hair on the back of their head. I think it was a sort of a mullet. And when they reached the age of puberty, or I don't know exactly what age, but then they cut the hair. And that's something I just put in the story. Mm-hmm. So the Hrezdanians, when the care goes from their mother to the father, and he teaches them how to tame horses, because it's a people that knows a lot of horses. Mm-hmm. Kind of like Mongolians also. I think Mongolians were really horse rider people. So what I found interesting is putting two peoples together that have a different view on maturity or coming of age. So the Betharians are really, they almost have to die to become mature, and they just reach a certain age, and their care goes from their mother to the father, and they get taught all these things about horses and stuff. And that was also an interesting dynamic that I wanted to explore in the story.
Mm-hmm. Do you also believe that the cultural dissonance between those two says something about the Betharian Empire in itself? Because you're telling four short stories that, as it reaches more places within that empire, in itself, that the four stories themselves also tell a lot about what the Betharian Empire was. Do you feel like adding these two cultures against each other, and that dissonance that exists there, that it says something about the place of the Betharian Empire and what it did to other nations?
Yeah, so that was a little bit like the Romans did it. So I initially started with the Betharians being this ruthless empire that just marauds and kills and rapes and pillages villages. Man, I should really start a rap career.
Not again.
But looking at history and just creating this, yeah, like I stated in the last episode, having this sort of orcish nature, just doing stuff mindlessly and destroying, it just doesn't make sense. And also from a historical perspective, like the Romans did, they just took over villages, Germanic villages, and they just let the people live and perhaps let them pay taxes or something, but they didn't just because what good is an empire if no one lives there because you killed everyone? That just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, or nobody wants to live there. And they built roads for a lot of villages, so there was more trade. Yeah. So in the end, I think it's also about cross-pollination, which happens in nature quite a lot.
Yeah, and one of the last dialogues I put in the story midway through, I think, was that when he's talking to the boy and he says, every people has their own strengths. Yours are taming horses or riding horses, and ours are warfare. And every people has their own
expertise.
Yeah, their own strengths and skills, and that's just the way the world should work. And me personally, that's not something I agree with, I think, but I just getting into his mindset as a Betharian, I thought, yeah, this could be a mindset that he can have.
I think it's interesting that you're saying, like, I wouldn't per se agree with this mindset, but I wrote it still. I think there's something, and not to toot your horn, but I think there's something mature in making someone the kind of like the hero or anti-hero, whatever you want to, like, I think it sits in a spectrum somewhere in between. Make someone that we should cherish and grow to love, while still writing his views as something you don't completely agree with.
Mm-hmm.
It's not very moralist, and I think a lot of writers tend to fall into that pitfall of, I have to imply my own way of looking at the world on others, while putting two thoughts of school of thoughts together that maybe neither you are 100% a subscriber to. It's very powerful.
I think that you see that especially in, well, let's say the big movie industries.
Yeah.
People just pushing their agenda, but that's something we will touch on another time. But I don't know. In book, I think that's also the strength of books, that you can describe a person as being a person that, even though his views of life are not something you can agree with, but you can understand it. And that's, I think, as a writer you should also be very empathetic. You should, as a writer, you should be able to write a racist and understand where he's coming from.
Yeah. It even makes me think of Catcher in the Rye, where that book, I didn't like the protagonist, but a writer helps you understand slices of life better, even if it's not your slice of life. I think that we're probably saying it now in very different ways with different examples, so it might be a little derogative, but I do think that it's that, and I think that what you did here is a slice of life from the Betharian Empire that does something that others maybe don't do in the same way. But that is a question that has been in my mind for a while now. There's something that this story does that none of the other ones do, and I've read them all. I've been quite fortunate in that. What does this story do for the quadrilogy of short stories that we have in process? What does this story do that the others don't? What does this add to the Betharian Empire and set up for the Betharian Empire and help us understand that the other short stories don't?
I tried to touch a little bit on the political side of things, and political meaning, how does the empire fit together? What do the settlements do for the bigger cities? So this settlement, I call them a Dumayat, and this one that the Chaemouron is the steward of, they breed horses, but there might be another one that just provides food, and they just create resources, and all these resources go, or at least a big part go, to the big cities to use in the war.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I try to explore a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
This one might be I think the fourth one is the most political one, because then you're following the Kothan, so he's the ruler of the empire. And
yes, but it touches less on the resources part of it. I think the economical side of it, maybe even. That's what it maybe does then, in that sense. Which is also very interesting to put in a setting near to samurais, because as you said, this man feels like a steward, and samurais were stewards of the land of the shogunate. And the people working for them were usually the people that would later become, in history, shinobi or even ninjas, as we know them now in mythology and lore and in history, in different versions. So it is interesting to see that dynamic come to fruition in a different world, where yes, they were either farmers or horsemen, or in that sense something that's applied to a bigger group of nations.
Yeah, funny, if I may interrupt you.
Go for it. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so you're naming samurai and ninjas, and that's actually what I wanted to do. I kind of approached it in the Neil Gaiman way. So what if samurais were in an icy area, and what if Vikings were ninjas?
Yeah.
That's kind of how. So I have these Garvanger, I named them, inspired by Vikings. But when we picture Vikings, it's these axe wielding berserkers, just raw force.
Yeah.
But I thought, okay, what if I make them silent assassins? And that's just that's how I try to make it a bit more unique.
And historically, it adds up. I mean, from both sides, I think Vikings used to be. I think a lot, of course, grows from agriculture and farmers. But Vikings used to be farmers before they built boats, and from there on started to travel to different lands. And the same for ninjas. They were basically just farm and stable hands revolting against the steward and the shogunate, saying, hey, we're the workforce here, not getting enough care, and it's winter and it's cold and we're not taken care of well enough, so we're gonna rebel. And how we're gonna do this is we're gonna, in the night, strike, as we will be less visible. We're going to set stables on fire, and we're basically going to destroy the property of the shogunate to rebel. And that became, because they were in the night and it was like a silent strike, that became the idea of a shinobi that later turned into ninja in myth. Because I think ninjas in itself, it's become more of a mythological thing and like a myth than that it is in historical the way it was. I think shinobi is a little bit more accurate. These things are quite interesting, and to put that into what if Vikings had that same kind of like evolution, what would be the version for Vikings of a kind of like rebelling kind of force in that? What would be the silent strike of the Vikings instead of like roaring from mountains and diving into it? But yeah, that's also nice how history keeps playing a part within your universe. It is it feels like an alternative reality to what could have happened with our world if we go further back into history.
Yeah, and that's always has been my approach. Yeah, first of all, I love history, but I think all, well, let's say fantasy authors do that. Like Tolkien, just what if England had a mythology, or Robert Jordan, what if the Chosen One was from some rural village and he didn't know how to use his power, and yeah, every author just does his own what if story.
Yeah, something sparks it at least.
Yeah.
A thing that kind of keeps haunting me from within this story is there's this scene, and I think that just... Just wait, Gathios. Eurusas sighed, shaking his head. This unsung hero isn't going to talk. Is there any other way we can get it out of you? Everyone has a breaking point. Where's this young man's? What do you call the treatment you give traitors? Blood wings? At that last word, the prisoner became restless. Began to yank at his shackles. I no read, really. With a blood-curdling cold-bloodedness, Eurusas pulled a razor-sharp knife from his tool rack and made a calculating gesture along the prisoner's back. Slowly, he sliced open the helpless man's back to expose his ribs. The man wailed and screamed deafeningly. Eurusas continued, undisturbed. He traded his knife for a small hammer and began to break loose the ribs piece by piece. So this gruesome, I think it's inspired by Blood Eagles. This is, the kid itself sees the horrors of war, but also the horrors of the Pantheon Empire. And even our Chaemouron is like, this is not what I don't subscribe to this way of dealing with our enemy. The Blood Wings. Why does it work that well? Why is it so... Because it is almost like a horror scene within a fantasy, and it feels like it should clash, but it doesn't. Like, first of all, how did you come up with it? Can you introduce the scene a little bit for us? And why does it work? Why did you want to insert it here? What is it?
Like I said before, the Chaemouron is a bit of a morally dubious figure. Like I said, I don't agree with his way of thinking, with his actions. And a scene before, or a few chapters before, I described how he had also killed children and women and men, just from a guerrilla point of view, and this might be a little bit inspired by the Vietnam War. So what happens when the enemy hides in the crowd? And so he just out of order killed people just because they were suspicious. But what I also described was he never did it for fun. So putting him next to a sadist, because the other another Chaemouron has survived the attack, but he's a sadist. And I wanted to put him, it's just this duality, like, okay, this Chaemouron Kletaios, which is the main protagonist, putting him next to Eurusas, the cruel one, creates this duality of, okay, Kletaios is a bad guy, Eurusas, he is really a sadist. He isn't, it's just a really bad guy. And it shows, so this Eurusas Chaemouron, he starts cutting a back open and pulling the lungs out, which is quite a gruesome scene, just to get information, who's behind the attack, this. And then showing the mercy of Kletaios, slitting the throat, so...
No, I get it, it's like save the cat.
Yeah, in their perspective, death is the only thing that can save him. Yeah. Because when your back's cut open and your ribs are being broken and your lungs are being pulled out, there's nothing that can really recover you. So he just kills the guy he slits his throat just to make the suffering stop. And that kind of creates this duality of putting him, who's a morally dubious person, next to a sadist, which makes him a morally good person.
It also helps you, I think, understand that if you're brought up in a nation that just coherently thinks a certain way, that they're still within that pretty... I think that the Betharians aren't the best people. They're warmongering people. They're not great. So as a society, there's a standard already for not the biggest, greatest morally... They're morally bankrupt in a way. Mm-hmm. So which versions exist of that? Are there better versions? Are there worse versions? I think that that scene does then, if I understand it well, explore how bad it could be and how much mercy you can find then in that situation as well. It is, for me, the strongest one. It's the strongest moment in the whole story, and it is very you.
Yeah, and it's something I didn't explore as well. How did he become this sadistic? Was it war trauma? Because in the previous story, Trial of Texas, the person 6 is also quite of a sadist. He enjoys putting fun, and I think it's just having a sense of power. I think sadists are people that just want to experience power, and they can do whatever they like to the person below them.
I think that this might be a little death of the author, but I see Apocalypse Now in here, if we're going back to the Vietnam War and Marlon Brando's character, which inspired by the Jungian complex and the shadow over there. You're subconsciously doing things that you're not interacting with the person anymore. You're interacting with the complex. I think Apocalypse Now really explains well how a decorated soldier can become that through the gruesomeness of war, or even just the nature of the people of the Betharian Empire. Now that we've really went deeply into the story itself, at least I feel that we've explored the bonds, we've explored the relationships between people, we explored different scenes. I want to talk a little bit about the structure and the editing, because I've been at the sidelines of this, seen draft 1 and seen draft 6. But what would you say are the biggest changes from the first finished draft to what we are able to read now?
Like I explained in the beginning, I didn't really have an ending, so I just wrote, and I was just like, well, let's see where this ends. But what I also explained in our very first episode is that I'm quite a action-based writer. So I put a lot of action sequences. It was fight after fight after fight after fight. I think at a certain point there were 3 or 4 chapters with fights, and I just wanted to explore the area, just the visual style of the area. But I was also like, I did this in the first book. Okay, it was a different area, but it was also very explanative. Is that the word?
Explanatory.
Explanatory, yeah. Sorry. And I was like, no, I just created this dynamic between the old man and the young boy. I just want this personal relationship and develop that instead of focusing on the snowy mountainsides and the coniferous forest and you name it. It's all beautiful. But that might be something that if it was a bigger story that I put more emphasis on that. But for this one, I just really wanted to focus on the personal relationships. So I just cut out all the fights.
As a gardener, you then kind of like let it grow, and you have this first draft. Is it then just finding something that speaks to you as a team and then cutting away things that don't work there? Is there like how do you then go from draft 1 to draft 2? Do you add more? Just more of the thing that speaks to you and then later start cutting things away? Because that seems like that's at least part of this story, but is that in general a thing that you do?
Yeah, that's a good one. It's been a while since I've been at draft 2. I think it's just adding things, cutting things. You know, in Word, you always see the word count. So you're reaching a certain amount of words, and then you're starting to think, okay, this new thing I created really needs to be in there. So what do I need to sacrifice for it? And I think that's just how it goes with waves. And like, okay, create this, scrap that. Create this, scrap that.
I do think that you have you've got a strong sense of what to add and what to sacrifice in that sense, because it does the last draft is definitely the purest form that you could get. I think also you've just at some point realized that because the story is about the son or like the kid and the old man, it's like the multiple fighting scenes that kind of do the same thing emotionally. You just scratched those and felt like it's better to have a campfire here and talk. Those, I think the first one had a lot less talking and a lot less of exploring that relationship, which is interesting. Are there other skills or things you've learned or you felt were particularly great learnings for other writers that you got from creating this story?
I think this personal relationship or this dynamic is something I took to the next story. So about the birthing wives, the uprising.
Daughters of Hes.
Daughters of Hes, yes, exactly. So this was a story about two people and the dynamics. And in the next story, I wanted to do a few things, but one of them was create a group dynamic. And I think the basics I took from this story. So, and furthermore, I just keep exploring, okay, how do the Betharians work? What are their belief systems? At a certain point, I was like, okay, should I create my version of nymphs, for example? Like nymphs are in Greek mythology are just forces of nature, actually. But when I started to add that, I was like, nah, I'm just straying away way too much from what needs to be told.
That's interesting though, because that does feel like that transfer to Hes herself. Like, is she actually a physical manifestation of someone in the Pantheon, or is this which still, like, that's something that, for instance, Zeus did as well. There's multiple ways in that the Pantheon can manifest, and if it's like a nymph and that being a force of nature, or Hes becoming then part of the Pantheon. I think that's even part in that's interesting in this story as well, how you expanded the Pantheon in helping the Chaemouron survive in these harsh, cold environments. Halfway up the mountain, he stopped to look out over the white peaks of the coniferous forest that stretched far beyond the horizon. He put down his weapon at his side and sat cross-legged on a protruding rock. He closed his eyes, began to take deep meditative breaths. Normally he did it naked to feel one with nature, but it took too much effort to take off his armor, so a fully harnessed meditation had to suffice for now. The sun crept slowly over the treetops, displacing the nighttime blues, giving way to golden and amber shades of morning light. With each stream of air that entered his nose, he felt himself strengthened by the breath of Laganea. We didn't even talk about that. Could you tell us a little bit more about this Pantheon and how you gave life to that in this story?
Yeah, that's something I can talk about, because that's also one of the inspirations I completely forgot about. But so the previous trial was the trial of Texas, in which the young boys need to be struck by lightning. But this for this icy environment, they get sent into the icy wastes of, I think I call it Tiferet. But yeah, so they need to survive in blistering cold. And this was inspired by our Dutch hero Wim Hof. And
yeah, the Iceman.
The Iceman, exactly. So with him doing all these breathing techniques, he can control his body from cold or heat. And even though the Betharians are this warmongering, bulky, forceful dudes, I find it interesting. What if they do a lot of meditation? I think they value their body very much. And yeah, so doing a lot of meditative exercises, just never feeling cold or heat or whatever.
I think even turning it into a strength. I think that's it's like they're, it's a power gifted to them, as that's how it feels. The power of Laganeia, the power of Laganeia that kind of like goes through his lungs, like that does feel like it's also in that sense a little bit of a physical manifestation. But it is like a superpower.
Yeah, and it's just a breathing technique, which they learn. But they believe it's the breath from the goddess, and I just leave that in the middle. I also had this small section in which I don't know what it's called in English, but I think my mom experienced it once. She burned her hands, and this woman in our neighborhood, she prayed over it, and the pain just vanished. And that's something I don't know if it's a placebo or you just have to believe it and then it works, but it worked. And that's the kind of magic I want to put in the story, since I don't want to put magic in my world. So him praying a little bit over the young boy who at a certain point gets burned in the story, praying over his wounds, and just the pain fading away. That was also something that and they can attribute it to Laganeia, the goddess, or it can just, like I said, be a placebo. That's something I just leave in the middle. I know it works in our world, whatever way, and yeah, that's the superpower I wanted to give him also.
And still, it helps us further. I think that is what happens in the story as well. It helps us to further establish that a fantasy doesn't necessarily need magic, but it can have a fantastical, magical element in it. So that's I think you're coming with solutions that our younger 22, 25-year-old minds couldn't completely fathom how we could bring those into fruition. I think that is also very interesting within this story.
Well, I'm not that old.
Yeah, no, I know, but like 10 years later, and you kind of fixed it here. So it's a decade. We putting things into relationship with each other that was at that point the half, like 10 years was like half of like 20. I think when we were pondering over that, we had like 10 years of conscious thinking about things, and now we've had 10 years of conscious thinking about a problem, and you kind of, I don't know, you've created this very creative approach to not having magic in your world while still making it feel like a fantasy.
Yeah, that's my goal. So I'm glad it worked for you.
Yeah. And I hope it works for other people as well. Would even say, if you're planning to read it, which I hope you do, please let us know in the comments what you thought of it. Or even just on talesofestis.com, basically leave a message or send an email, something like that. Get in contact, but let Leonard know what you thought about the story. Would you like to add something to that, Leonard, as well?
No, you can read The Fury of the Chaemouron. There's also The Trial of Texas. There's 2 stories online now, and
Daughters of Hess coming, I think, in 2 months or something. No?
Yeah, I'll do my best. I aim to have it ready by then.
That's perfect. So. Well, and further on YouTube, we've had a few explorations, a few episodes out that have been quite interesting. We've done something on Medium and how storytelling changes throughout that. What's coming, of course, as well, where we're gonna do a few explorations on storytelling within series like Game of Thrones, House of Dragons, those kind of things. So be on the lookout of that, and definitely check out all of our other content as well from a writer's perspective. We thank you for listening as well.